Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be exploring the fascinating world of psychosocial development in late adulthood. We'll be diving deep into Chapter 25 of a developmental psychology textbook to uncover how our emotional and social lives evolve as we age.
Sound like fun.
You know how some folks say that with age comes wisdom? Well, this chapter really digs into that idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's packed with theories and research and even some real-world examples.
Exactly, and it all starts by introducing us to Doris, a 90-year-old woman who is anything but the stereotypical retiree.
Oh, what's she up to?
She's leading protests, sending out hundreds of greeting cards, and even championing local street performers.
Wow, she sounds amazing.
Right. She really embodies the idea that aging doesn't have to mean slowing down.
I love that. So what are some of the big questions that this chapter tackles?
Well, we're going to be diving into things like, will we become sadder or happier as we age?
Oh, that's a good one.
What about relocating to a sunny spot? Is it all it's cracked up to be? And what's the real story on home care versus nursing homes?
Some heavy stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, but this chapter tackles it head on. Let's start with some of the key theories that try to explain how we navigate the aging process.
Okay, sounds good.
The chapter starts with self theories, which focus on this idea that as people get older, they strive to become their authentic selves.
So like shedding all those external pressures and expectations?
Exactly, getting to the core of who they really are.
I can see how that would lead to greater happiness and well-being.
Especially when those older adults feel in control of their lives.
Yeah, makes sense.
But does that also mean they become more stubborn?
Ugh, how so?
Well, the chapter mentions a link between authenticity and clinging to familiar objects and routines, even to the point of hoarding. It even brings up Doris again, and her attachment to her belongings.
I see what you mean. There's definitely a tension there, right? On one hand, you have self-expression and this sense of continuity.
But on the other hand,
It could become problematic if it's excessive.
it really makes you think about where that line is.
Definitely a nuanced issue. So what's next?
Okay, let's move on to one of the most well-known theories of psychosocial development, Erikson's integrity versus despair stage.
Oh yeah, the final stage, right, where we grapple with our life experiences.
Right, and try to integrate them with our vision of ourselves and our place in the community, basically looking back and making sense of it all.
And if you're successful, you achieve integrity.
Right. But if you're left with regrets or unresolved conflicts, you might experience despair.
Makes sense.
And here's a fascinating tidbit from the chapter. Depression is actually statistically more common in middle age than in late adulthood.
Really? That's so interesting.
The chapter suggests that maybe that feeling of integrity, like Erikson talked about, might actually protect against despair as we get older.
Like we've learned to cope with life's ups and downs and come to terms with who we are.
It's a hopeful thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, the next theory we're going to dive into is called Socioemotional Selectivity Theory.
Okay, what's that one about?
Well, it looks at how our relationships and social circles evolve as we age.
Interesting. So as we get older, our priorities change.
Exactly. We have a greater awareness of our mortality, and that can lead us to prioritize relationships that bring us joy and emotional fulfillment.
So we become more selective about who we spend our time with.
Less about making new friends, more about deepening those bonds with family and close friends.
Quality over quantity.
Exactly. And the chapter also mentions something called the positivity effect.
What's that?
Basically, it's this tendency for older adults to better remember positive experiences and emotions.
So do you think that's a healthy adaptation? Or are they just avoiding reality?
Ooh, good question. Something for our listeners to think about. Maybe it's a bit of both.
Right. Maybe it's a form of self-preservation or a natural byproduct of all those life experiences.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the role of social forces in all of this.
Sounds good.
The chapter goes into stratification theories, which examine how things like ageism, sexism, and racism can actually create disadvantages that accumulate over a lifetime.
Right, that makes sense. It's not just about individual experiences, but also about these systemic inequalities.
Exactly. And the chapter specifically highlights this double jeopardy faced by older women.
Because they experience both ageism and sexism.
Right, which can put them at greater risk for things like financial insecurity, especially if they spend years as unpaid caregivers or in lower-paying jobs.
It's like a double whammy,
Exactly. And then on top of that, you have the impact of ethnicity and income.
making it even harder to age well.
The chapter really drives home the point that poverty early in life can have long-lasting consequences, and those consequences can be exacerbated by discrimination.
It's like a domino effect.
Now, here's a theory that's stirred up some debate.
Oh, what's that one?
It's called the disengagement theory, and it basically suggests that society pushes older adults to withdraw from active roles.
Hmm, interesting. Is that true?
Well, it's been challenged by the activity theory, which argues the opposite,
Yeah.
that older adults actually want to stay engaged and contribute to society.
So which one is it?
Honestly, it's probably a mix of both. Individual preferences and societal expectations all rolled into one.
So some might welcome a slower pace of life, while others might feel frustrated by a lack of opportunities to stay involved.
Exactly. And here's another head-scratcher for you. The happiness paradox.
That sounds intriguing.
The chapter points out that immigrant elders often report higher levels of life satisfaction than non-immigrants, even though they might face more hardship.
Really? Why is that?
Well, the chapter suggests it could be because of their resilience, their strong social support systems, or maybe even different cultural values.
Makes you wonder what truly leads to happiness in later life, huh?
It really does. There's no single formula, especially as we age. But that's a conversation for another time.
Looking forward to it.
So let's move on to the next section, shall we? Activities in late adulthood. Get ready to bust some myths about inactive elders.
I'm all ears.
First up, the myth of retirement as a time of complete withdrawal from work.
Oh, I know plenty of people who are still working well into their 60s and 70s.
The chapter says that it's a growing trend, and it's not always just about the money.
Some people genuinely love what they do.
And some might just crave that social connection or intellectual stimulation.
It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all experience.
And speaking of changing norms, the chapter also explores this idea of bridge jobs.
Bridge jobs, what are those?
They're part-time or flexible roles that help people transition from full-time work to retirement.
Ah, I get it. Like a way to gradually adjust to a slower pace of life.
While still maintaining a sense of purpose.
I like it.
Now let's talk about volunteering.
Okay, I'm a big believer in giving back.
Me too. And the chapter highlights how volunteering can have incredible benefits.
For both the individual and the community.
Exactly. It's a great way for older adults to stay active, contribute their skills and experience, and connect with others.
And I've heard it can even improve their health.
You heard right. The chapter mentions a study that found that volunteering can actually cut the death rate in half.
Wow, that's amazing.
I know, right? But here's the thing. Despite all those benefits, the rates of formal volunteering among older adults are relatively low.
Why do you think that is?
It could be a lack of awareness about opportunities, logistical barriers, or maybe even a perception that their contributions aren't valued.
That's a shame. We need to find ways to encourage and support older adults who want to volunteer.
Absolutely. Now, on to a topic that's probably close to a lot of people's hearts. Home sweet home.
Ah, yes. The desire to age in place.
Exactly, to stay in their own homes for as long as possible. I think it's a natural human instinct.
It is. It's about independence, autonomy, and that feeling of continuity.
And the good news is that it's becoming more and more feasible thanks to advances in technology, home modifications, and supportive services.
That's wonderful to hear.
The chapter even talks about naturally occurring retirement communities, or NRRCs.
NRCs, what are those?
They're basically neighborhoods or apartment complexes where a large proportion of the residents have aged in place together.
Oh, I see. So they've formed this natural support network over time.
Exactly. It's a great example of how communities can help older adults thrive.
I love that. So what's next?
Okay, let's dive into two topics that can be pretty influential in later life: religion and politics.
It's interesting. Aren't older adults often seen as less engaged in those areas?
Yeah, there are definitely some stereotypes out there, but the research paints a more nuanced picture. For example, did you know that faith and prayer tend to increase as people age? And there might even be a link between religious involvement and well-being.
That makes sense. It can provide comfort and meaning.
And when it comes to politics, while older adults might not be as visible in protests or rallies, they're highly engaged in the political process.
So they're still making their voices heard.
Exactly. They might be voting, staying informed, or even writing letters to their representatives.
Good for them.
Now, let's wrap up this first part of our deep dive with a look at friends and relatives.
Because relationships are everything, right?
Absolutely. And this section really emphasizes how vital companionship and social connections are for well-being as we age.
Even though our social circles might shrink as we get older.
The remaining relationships often become even more precious.
Makes sense. It's about quality, not quantity.
The chapter specifically highlights the benefits of those long-term couples who've been together for decades.
They have that built-in support system.
Exactly, like they've weathered life's storms together.
I love that.
And the chapter shares a sweet example of an older couple who despite their differing political views, manage to maintain a strong and loving relationship.
Ah, that's really sweet.
It's a reminder that even in areas where we disagree, we can still find common ground.
For sure, we all need those connections that make life richer and more meaningful.
Okay, before we move on, let's touch on the changing family structure for a moment.
Okay, how's it changing?
Well, the chapter talks about this concept of the beanpole family.
Hmm.
Imagine a tall, slender beanpole.
I'm picturing it.
Multiple generations, but fewer members at each level.
So fewer siblings, cousins, and so on.
Exactly. And that can impact how different generations interact and support each other.
Makes sense. So less of a safety net.
In a way, yes. And the chapter also talks about this concept of filial responsibility, which is the obligation of adult children to care for their aging parents.
It's interesting how that varies across cultures.
Right. In some, it's considered a duty, while in others, it's more of a shared responsibility.
And things like government policies can also play a role.
Absolutely. Access to affordable elder care, Social Security benefits, parental leave, all these things factor in.
Wow, it's really complex.
It is. Now, let's finish up with a quick look at grandparenthood and great-grandparenthood.
Oh, those are special roles.
They really are. The chapter talks about how these relationships can evolve over time, from active caregiving to offering support, wisdom, and connection to family history.
It's like a second chance to experience the joys of parenting, but with more wisdom and perspective.
And finally, the chapter emphasizes the importance of friendships, especially when we experience the loss of a partner.
Makes sense. Friends can be a lifeline during difficult times.
Absolutely. They provide a sense of connection, support, and shared experiences. No matter how old we get, we all need those close connections.
Couldn't agree more. Welcome back.
So last time we were talking about some pretty hopeful aspects of aging
Right, like that search for authenticity.
and the importance of relationships.
Yeah, but now it's time to get real.
This chapter doesn't sugarcoat it. It dives right into the challenges of frailty and caregiving. We're talking about the portion of the older population who need help with daily tasks.
And it starts by making this really important distinction between two things. Activities of daily living, or ADLs,
Okay.
and instrumental activities of daily living, or ADLs. So ADLs are like the really basic things.
The stuff we usually take for granted.
Exactly. Eating, bathing, getting dressed. But for some older adults, those things can be really tough.
Yeah, and it can make it hard to live on their own.
Exactly. And then you've got IADLs, which are a bit more complicated.
Like what?
Think managing finances, taking meds correctly, using technology, stuff like that.
So it's not just about physical limitations.
No, it's about cognitive skills, too. Being able to plan and navigate the world.
Right, and the chapter really emphasizes how important it is to prevent or delay frailty as much as possible.
Yeah, staying active is huge.
It's funny, we usually think of exercise as something for younger people.
But it's even more crucial as we age.
It's about strength, balance, staying mobile.
Totally. And don't forget about the cognitive side of things, too.
Right, the chapter talks about early detection and treatment of cognitive decline.
Catching those memory problems early on can make a big difference.
But even with prevention, some people will need more support,
Yeah, and that's where caregiving comes in.
which can be incredibly demanding.
For both the person needing care and their family.
The chapter really doesn't hold back when it comes to describing those challenges.
It can be super tough on family caregivers.
Many of them are older spouses or adult children who are already juggling a lot,
And they often end up providing round-the-clock care.
which can lead to burnout, isolation, sometimes even resentment.
Yeah, it's a lot to handle. And it's not the same everywhere, right?
Right, the chapter talks about how cultural expectations and government support can make things even more complicated,
In some cultures, family caregiving is just expected.
while in others, there's more reliance on outside help.
And then you've got government policies that can impact things like access to elder care or financial assistance.
That's a whole web of factors.
But there's good news too, right? Like this whole movement toward integrated care.
Yes, that's where professionals and family members work together.
It's a much more collaborative approach.
And it recognizes that everyone has different needs.
Much better than a one-size-fits-all approach. Okay, now onto a sensitive but crucial issue.
Elder abuse.
It's something we can't ignore.
The chapter acknowledges that it's a real problem for many older adults,
And it points to some of the risk factors.
like caregiver stress, social isolation, cognitive impairment.
So sometimes it's not even intentional.
Yeah, it can be a result of just overwhelming circumstances.
And a lack of support.
And remember, elder abuse isn't always physical violence.
No, it can be emotional neglect or financial exploitation too.
And those can be really hard to detect, especially if it's happening within a family.
There's so much shame and secrecy around it.
The chapter stresses that we need to raise awareness and provide support for caregivers.
And create safe spaces for older adults to report abuse.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about long-term care options.
Like, what kinds of facilities are out there?
Well, this chapter runs through the whole spectrum, from aging in place to assisted living to nursing homes.
And it's clear that there's no one perfect solution.
The chapter does point out this trend away from nursing homes and towards aging in place.
Which makes sense, right? People want to stay in their own homes.
As long as they can.
But it's not always possible.
Especially if someone needs a lot of care.
So then what are the options?
Well, that's where assisted living comes in.
Okay, I've heard of those, but never really understood what they were.
It's kind of like a middle ground.
Between living on your own and a nursing home.
Right. They offer different levels of support and supervision depending on what someone needs.
So you might have your own apartment, but also get help with things like meds or personal care.
Exactly. But the chapter does say we need to be careful about quality and oversight.
Yeah, you want to make sure you're choosing a good facility.
Absolutely. And no matter where someone ends up, the most important thing is personalized care.
Treating each person with dignity and respect.
And recognizing that they have unique needs and preferences.
I like that. So does the chapter just end there?
Well, it finishes with this really heartwarming story about a 98-year-old woman.
Okay.
And even though she was declining, she was able to bounce back with the right medical care.
Wow, that's inspiring.
It's a reminder that even in late adulthood, there's always hope.
And potential for a fulfilling life.
Yeah. It's never too late. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've covered so much ground already, from that search for authenticity to the challenges of caregiving. But as we wrap up this chapter, I'm really curious about cognitive health in later life. It's something that comes up a lot.
Yeah, for sure. And you might be surprised to hear this, but the chapter actually starts off pretty positive.
Oh, how so?
Well, it seems like the fear of severe cognitive decline might be a little overblown. The data suggests it's not as common as we think.
Really? That is surprising. I feel like there's this assumption that dementia is just inevitable as we age.
Right, but this chapter actually includes this map, showing the percentage of older adults with neurocognitive disorders in different parts of the world. And globally, it's less than 8% of people over 65 who have severe brain disease.
Wow, that's way lower than I would guess.
It's interesting, right?
Yeah, definitely. But even though severe cognitive decline might not be as widespread as we fear, those cases that do occur must have a huge impact, not just for the individuals, but for their families and for society as a whole.
Absolutely. And the chapter doesn't shy away from the economic realities of caring for someone with a neurocognitive disorder. Like, Alzheimer's and other major NCDs are some of the costliest chronic diseases out there.
Right, and the costs go way beyond just medical care.
For sure. Think about the burden on family members who are often providing unpaid care.
It's emotionally and financially draining.
Exactly. It's a really complex issue.
And this chapter digs into those challenges, like the different costs of care in various countries. Sobering stuff.
Yeah, it really highlights those social and financial implications. But overall, this chapter has been quite a journey. We've talked about everything from personal growth to societal challenges and the realities of frailty and caregiving.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
But what are some key takeaways for our listeners? As they navigate their own aging journey, what should they keep in mind?
Well, I think the biggest one is that aging is not one size fits all.
Right, it's not just this downward slope.
It's so diverse and influenced by so many factors.
Individual choices, social context.
Exactly. So it's important to embrace the uniqueness of each person's journey.
And remember that late adulthood isn't just about decline. There's still so much potential for growth and even finding a deeper sense of purpose.
It's about challenging those stereotypes and seeing the possibilities.
And that's a great message to end on. We all have the power to shape our own experience of aging no matter what.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of late adulthood. We'll see you next time for another insightful exploration.